A safe route between Bligh's Folly and Hot Springs was established, but others had yet to be considered. Perhaps it was because development with the other two settlements had not yet been enough. The windy beach revealed nothing but familiar locations. The Dreadnoughts and Tesla City. Tesla City would be after the Dreadnoughts, because that American settlement was never the safest. It was then we decided to send some improvements to the children's mine. Largely because we were a little behind in that regard. And speaking of behind, I noticed that the people needed housing improvements. That would need to be dealt with before the drop in temperature. Because that would result in discontent towards me for not getting on top of that. And would make them question why I was in charge at all. Although I wisely decided to write ceremonial burials into law. As well as provide additional improvements to the children's mine. Apparently there were difficult relations with the people we sent and the rough inhabitants of the shipwreck camp. But they managed to get on with each other, so there was no need to get involved. Besides, they were most helpful with the supplies they were sending. Largely because they knew we would deliver. we were certainly more trustworthy than New London would be. If there was something wrong, they decided to keep us in the dark about it. It required almost all of the wood and steel available, but at least the people of Bligh's Folly would be ready for the lowering of temperature. At least for the next few days. As for the dreadnoughts, the USS Prometheus, the one that brought the Americans here. And speaking of Americans, I sent the scout group to the place that they once called their home, involving a maddened Croat scientist who apparently let the power get to his head. And ultimately destroyed any semblance of civilization there. I was questioning whether or not I only delayed their demise, as those that remained in New London would be at the mercy of their new ruler. Those that followed me, on the other hand, well, they were somewhat safer. A specific amount of improvements were needed before settlement requested a safe route based on what happened with Hot Springs. But progress was steady. As long as the supplies kept flowing in, of course. Can't make improvements without those, can we? With the steam core acquired, the army warehouse detail was moved on to gathering steel, something which was needed more. As the sooner we made enough improvements to the other settlements, the sooner we could have a safe route built for them, providing a more reliable supply route. Which would help us out with what little time remained. Yes, we requested something different in Hot Springs this time because food was quite abundant by this point. Abundant enough to provide extra rations for the ill. Oh yes, and the scout party had arrived at Tesla City. There wasn't much left, and what was left, it looked dangerous. But I considered the danger worth the risk. And the gamble paid off. There was something in the distance worth looking into. The scouts were sent in that direction. As for one that had died in Hot Springs, our people wanted to take him back for burial. I decided to have him be composted in Hot Springs to make sure we didn't offend. those that had helped us out in the past. And after requesting some more supplies, all that could be done was to wait. Wait for the supplies to be delivered. Wait for what was required in order to see if there was anything more that needed to be done. Wait for any further wait for any additional developments regarding the New London problem. Oh yes, there was also waiting for the scouts to reach a frozen mirage, light reflected by a lake. Although there was signs of life nearby that lake. It was worth investigating at least. Night was passing by. And wood and other things was being delivered. The hot springs had one more thing that could be improved there. But that would need to wait until more steel was available. shipwreck camp had problems. Apparently, most were convicted for rather petty criminal acts. I decided to let them burn the records of their offences, as what did it matter? Survival was considered more necessary, and the unequal worlds which resulted in them turning to crime in the first place was no longer there. They had a second chance at life. They had better not waste it. It would seem that my suspicions were correct. That's when there aren't enough criminals to crack down on. They'll make them. Anything to fill the convict labour quota for the generator construction. Thankfully, the improvements for the shipwreck camp only needed steel to be delivered. Why? Because steel was not going to run out for some time yet with Bligh's Folly. Certainly not within the next few days, anyway. Former leper colony became the only salvation for those who have lost everything. Those that were willing to come with us. They came with the scout party to be returned to Bligh's Folly. Where they could hopefully rebuild their lives after losing some of those, including the convicts of the shipwreck camp. They had nothing to lose to begin with, and so had everything to gain from rebellion and forming their own settlements. It was at this point that the shipwreck camp suggested a safe route be built between their settlement and ours. It was at this point that the shipwreck camp wanted to know if there was a source of food that they could call on. We put them in touch with the hot spring settlements. They seem to be quite reasonable. And not just to us. We requested more supplies from them, and they were willing to send them here, considering what we've done for them so far. Yes, it's best not to treat those you're trying to get them to help you. Sorry. Losing grasp on words. It's best not to look down on them, as that does not give a good impression. Then again, you should not let them confuse that for weakness either.
Leave your workplaces in order.
As there's some that would exploit that. Apparently the improvements to the children's mine have left some with nothing to do. It was decided that it would be best to not get involved, because it would be likely that it'd be unwelcome to have a cookhouse built and have the children run that, nor would it be a good idea to have the unemployed children be sent to hot springs. Oh yes, and the safe route between the children's mine and Bligh's Folly could be built as well, but wood was considered a higher priority. So that one would be built first. And it looks like more steam cores would be needed eventually. Well, when there was enough wood and steel to spare for the improvements that need that also. The construction team was sent to the closest point to our settlement for the shipwreck camp settlement, safe route. there would likely be enough resources to make a start on it by the time they arrived. Either that or it would be certainly close. And considering that the temperature would be lowering even more than it was considered a prudent investment to have a higher setting for the braziers. There would be enough coal spare for that. Well, at least the other settlements couldn't accuse us of taking without giving. Oh yes, and apparently there's been some sabotage of the equipment we had installed. I agreed to joint watches, as it was their settlement. And we were the ones who installed that equipment. Once the supply situation allowed for it, we would send it there. Send what they needed to establish the joint watch. The safe routes were lined up, but there needed to be resources to establish them, and it was unclear of any setbacks. Well, they would be revealed once found. The trading depot at the shipwreck camp would receive an upgrade. The rest of the steel would be saved for the first stage of that safe route. The same thing would be needed for the children's mine, when it eventually would be worked on. Any other improvements that could be made, that would depend on what would be needed more, and it would also depend on my preferences at the time. I intended to have all of them made. As for the improvements to the braziers, there was no rush for that, as the temperature would decrease. Well, by the time it did increase, the improvements would have been made. And then the engineers would be reassigned to where they would be most needed. There were no significant setbacks with the first stage of the safe route to the shipwreck camp. And so they moved on to the next one. The scout team had a sturdy shelter to look into. As for the children's mine, there was a rescue that was needed. I ordered our people to help theirs rescue that child. One of the improvements that was needed was steam cores for their hothouse. I plan to have that made before the before New London attacked. And as for the improvements to the braziers, those would only be used when the temperature required it. Right, what else was there to consider? Oh yes, an upgrade to the children's mine trading depot.
Shifts over. Leave your workplaces
That would have needed to be
order.
done at some point, so I thought, why not do that in preparation for when that would be constructed and established. It was not as if the resources were needed elsewhere. Considering that research... yes. And apparently there were dangers at the middle point of... well, we could spare the woods, so... additional safety measures were established. The construction team then moved on to the final stage of the safe routes. The children's mine was quite thankful for our assistance, although there was a hint that it was some sort of test among the children. This was quickly silenced. I didn't press them for information about that. And besides, Bligh's Folly had a minor problem with a lack of housing. A problem that needed to be remedied. And was quickly remedied. Better housing was needed at the shipwreck camp, and it was decided that it would be better if they had separate quarters. This was considering that a few of them were not the nicest of individuals. And they needed time by themselves. progress being made on the shipwreck camp safe routes, and other improvements to follow. It was looking to be on track for the preparations.